Okay, after that classy roll-in, this is Going Viral, the movie show. And so far we have Ken Aaron on the West Coast, that's me. And back on the East Coast, we've got Alex Stavropoulos, or Ropopoulos, something like that. It's Greek, right? Dennis Goldstein, and Jim Dingeman's with us, coming in and out. Let's see, here he comes now. And maybe later we're going to have Mike join us too. So the first we're going to start out, we're talking about movies, and we're going to have Alex tell us about one of his favorite movies. And you got the floor. Go for it.
Are you going to play the trailer first, Ken?
Okay, let me get to the trailer.
Yeah.
Let me get to that trailer. 1 second. Oh, the trailer. Oh, that's not there. That's there. Okay.
I can easily bring it up if you need me to, Ken.
It's a little more difficult doing it that way, Alex, as you'll find out.
Oh, okay. Well,
it's not like Zoom.
Okay.
Okay, so let me get the trailer. Here comes the trailer for the Velvet Underground.
Yeah.
The Velvet Underground.
1 second. I have to share this.
That's your favorite movie?
Well, Ken's is the one who's saying that. I just really enjoyed it seeing at the film forum. So, but it's not my favorite. No.
Okay, it's coming up now.
I'd say they're one of my favorite bands. Yeah.
Huh.
I'm pretty sure this is the trailer.
Oh, you're too young for all that punk stuff.
Yep. Oh yeah.
And the Mud Club. Yeah. All my friends used to go down there, get high, and get laid.
Oh. Wasn't around.
Yeah, I know you weren't around.
Hey, come on. Let's try this.
We're not seeing it. Oh,
wrong one. Wait a minute. Take it.
There you go.
Geez, I'm not seeing. Oh, no, it's not that. Let me share it again.
Where's that from? DW?
Oh, I know what it is. I know what I made. I know what I made my mistake. Here we go. No, I just have to hit this button here. Share. That's all. There we go. Okay, here it comes. Sorry for the delay, my incompetence. And the trailer go ahead. Here it is.
You got to go back to
That was my first time in New York, and I was appalled. This place is filthy.
Cinema, money, parties. It was outrageous.
People came because the cameras were running. They thought they could become famous.
At the center of it is the exploding art world.
It opened your eyes to a lot of possibilities.
We started getting a following, but a lot of radio stations wouldn't play our stuff.
The sound, not only was it new, but it was radically different.
We were studying natural harmonics.
Shiny, shiny.
Lowell's music was very heavy. Everything he does in that craggly voice of his resonated. That weirdness, it shouldn't have existed in this space.
His music sounded like nothing else. And all of a sudden, it would stop like that, and the audience would be dead silent. The Velvet Underground had hypnotized them.
1, 2, 3.
Lou always was very clear that there's no difference between being a writer of the book and a writer of lyrics.
The artist is not with society. He's different.
I was interested in communicating to people who were on the outside.
They were going to blaze a trail, which eventually they did.
evening. We're your local Velvet Underground.
Okay, all right, Alex. While I'm queuing up the next one, tell us a little bit about this musical group and why they're so revolutionary.
Right. Well, let me start. Saying went to see it at the Film Forum. It's playing down there, in New York City, for the next few weeks. Again, this is obviously there have been earlier documentaries about the Velvet Underground, but this one is the first to have John Cale, who in the past, legendary avant-garde musician who was along with Lou Reed, one of the two main people in the band, and one of the great innovators in the use of feedback, but also integrating ideas from he was originally a classical musician from Wales, came over here, got involved with the Andy Warhol scene, and joined together with Lou Reed, Sterling Morrison, and Maureen Tucker to form the Velvet Underground, which of course is truly one of the great bands and one of the most innovative. Again, the Brian Eno's line on is always that, their first album, Velvet Underground and Nico, only sold 10,000 copies, but everybody who got a copy went out and started a band, is the cliche about them. Because again, they're incredibly innovative in the use of feedback, use of oral harmonics, tone, which was one of the things they really talk about a lot in how they're kind of, especially John Cale, had gotten into this idea of, drone, using, tonal harmonics, and kind of plug through a piece of music. Before they show a clip in this documentary about how a few, 2-3 years before he helped start the Velvet Underground, he did an 18-hour concert where he played the same piece of music 400 times in a row. He was on one of those kind of variety shows, where they had weird people come, this is the weird story that we're going to talk about. And he came to come, where there'd be a panel of semi-famous people that they would, then ask him questions about this wacky concert he did, again, an 18-hour essentially piece of music. And then they interview a bunch of, the people around the Warhol scene, Jonas Mekas, they got Amy Tobin and Mary Warrenov, who were, part of the Factory and so on. And a few others. I mean, they got Lou Reed's sister to talk about her brother, some of Lou Reed's, college buddies, essentially, to talk about his early, his career before, because he was working for Polygram before he got involved with all the Velvet.
Okay, this is not in the clip we're going to see.
Yeah, this is but it's in the documentary. They go,
okay. I have to ask you a question. I got to ask you a question.
Sure.
What is it about this group, as a group, that you liked? Was it the humor, the outrageous outlandishness, the anti-establishment? What about it?
Lyrics. The lyrics are really meaningful. They're in contrast to most groups of the time. They're not afraid. They're not afraid to talk about heavy things like drug use. I mean, the most famous song, "Heroin," is just about what it feels like to do that drug, based on Lou Reed's own personal experiences, having done it quite a bit. Of course, later on became an addict, then became clean. But yeah, he knew, and but it's more, again, the oral sound. I mean, with some of their songs, it's literally you could see they create a wall of sound, as they call it. Yeah. So it's kind of pumping out at you. It's it's loud, it's fast, but it also can be soft and quiet. They're good at change of tempo, but also kind of, again, the idea is use of oral harmonics, giving, like famously heroin only has 2 chords. So it's the same 2 chords repeated in different combinations through the whole song. So it gets into you. There's a certain amount of like repetition and just the emotional experience. Again, having that kind of repetition of the sound patterns, what it does to you. And I mean, yeah.
Okay,
so that's
so
what I love about it. Yeah.
Okay, let's watch this clip. Now it's about 9 minutes long. You want us to see the whole thing? Or?
No. Just
About 5
this
minutes.
is from their 93. They did a reunion tour, got back together in 93, before Sterling Morrison died of, I think it was cancer. So and they broke up. This is the one concert they ever taped in Paris. Yeah.
Okay,
so
let's give
I
it a
guess this will
shot.
show some of the innovation, how innovative they were too. Again, even
Okay.
30 years after they originally did it. Yeah.
All right, let's go to this. Let's hope this.
So this is heroin. Yeah.
Okay, this is heroin.
Yeah.
Thing.
So you can see again, John Cale's playing an electric viola. That's, for the time that was just new. I want to bring the sound up a little. Ken. No, it's
That's
yeah,
the
bring the
sound we
volume
got.
up. Yeah, I know how you do that. All right, that's better.
I don't know just where I'm going.
I mean, the way people have described the song is it's the sonic equivalent of the feeling you get from doing the drug, essentially. The way it's kind of like it'll go faster, like your heart beats faster. It's kind of supposed to be in sync with that, essentially. It gets you pumping to listen to it. Here, again, the song goes slow, then fast, then slow, then fast again.
When I put a spike into my vein, then things aren't quite the same. When I'm rushing on my run, I feel just like Jesus, son. I guess that I just don't know. I guess that I just don't know.
It gets back to slow now. Then I'll go back fast.
I have made very big decision. I'm gonna try. I'm going to try to nullify my life. 'Cause when the blood begins to flow, when it shoots up the dropper's neck,
Drummer Maureen Tucker, she's not using sticks, she's using mallets. It's a very different way most drummers in rock bands do that.
all your pills with all your secret talk. Ah, you could all go take a walk.
You have very much a lot of African
Guess that I
influence
just
in
don't know. I guess
that
that
unique
I just don't know.
bands at the time. All right, give about another minute. And
Okay.
we can talk here. But yeah, I was listening to John Cale's electric viola, kind of dragging in the background. and providing the feedback too. You know.
I wish that I was born 1,000 years ago. I wish that I wish that I'd sail the Dorcas seas in a great big copper ship, going from this land here to that.
Okay, we're speeding up again.
You can cut it when you want. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's talk about it. So guys,
again, there's several, unique elements against, what's typical. I think you guys probably remember better than I do, what was music around 66, 67. They talk about, one of the fun things towards the middle of the documentary is they talk about Maureen Tucker. Again, only she and John Cale are still alive from the original 4 members of the band. Of course, Lou Reed died from liver complications, I think in 2013. Sterling Morrison died from cancer, and I think it was like 94, 95. So they're the ones with the interviews now. All the comments from Lou Reed and Sterling Morrison are previous interviews that they found. So she says about they did a tour out to LA, and apparently Frank Zappa, they were playing this club that hated them in LA, and Frank Zappa was on before him, and you should hear the contempt she expresses for what she calls that hippie music, because there's she literally says what the fuck were these people doing? The whole idea that you give a person a flower and love can change the world. No, just that's not what we thought. We thought you're gonna change the world. You act to change the world. You don't just change the world through love. And it's this whole kind of New York contempt for that kind of California music style. They show a clip from the Mamas and Papas to give you an idea of what they mean. But again, and it's a very, one of the interesting things through the movie is, of course, the role of New York, of course, where they met, but the kind of environment, which again, well, obviously can't remember because I wasn't born yet, but you guys were around for some of that. And I know Jim was in the Village, so I don't know how much connection he had to that kind of scene back there in the 60s.
Well, let's give it to Jim. Let's see what he comes up with. Hey, Jim, what can you tell us about the Velvet Underground?
Well, I never really liked them. I like.
Well,
I always
a lot of people.
Reed. I always liked Lou Reed.
Oh, yeah.
To consider that their great influence on rock and roll, that I consider complete bullshit. Maybe now in retrospect they're looking at that, because the Velvet Underground used to hang out in Max's Kansas City.
Right.
Which was the big hipster hangout. And I just remember going in there and seeing Warhol, because it was part of Max's Kansas City was over on the northern side of Union Square. Between, I guess it was 17th.
It was 17th, 16th.
Yeah. It was on the east side.
On the east side, yeah.
And the owner there, the Velvet Underground used to go into the back room. That's where Warhol used to go.
Right.
And so when I was a senior in high school in '66, the big thing was to sneak into Max's. The hipster girls were always trying to sneak into Max's to try to hang out with all the different groupies and rock and roll people down there. Now, I must admit, a song about heroin does not fucking impress me in the fucking least. Having myself done heroin once, and I said, oh my God, no wonder one should stay away. And that was after I'd had a lot of friends of mine die of heroin. So I figured, okay, let me have a little taste of this. Let me see what's so attractive. And I saw how attractive it was, how seductive it was. I never touched it again. And so I always had a real hard time dealing with any nostalgic sort of songs about using drugs because I'd seen too many people go off the deep end. Now, with an attitude towards Frank Zappa, I mean, so you're saying to me that these individuals from the Lower East Side in New York City, because that's when we sort of got together in the early 60s. Gail, if I recall, was a big fan of John Cage's.
Right,
and
right.
when I was a sophomore at Music and Art, they brought John Cage up there to play his 8-tone of music. And I said, what the fuck? I said, it wasn't my thing. I mean, I sort of, as I've gotten older, had a greater appreciation of it. But, our rock and roll was, and I'll say to Lou Reed, in Lou Reed's credit, he was very much, he said, look, my God is rock and roll.
Yeah.
And I could dig that. I could definitely dig that. But to say that Frank Zappa, I mean, are you saying that these guys thought Frank Zappa was in the same league as Mamas and the Papas? Is that what?
They thought he was part of that. Yeah,
that's bullshit.
That hippie music.
Yeah, no, that's bullshit.
Yeah.
Because if you listen to Mothers of Invention,
sure,
that is a complete satire on everything about American life.
Right.
At the time. I mean, do you wear your jock a lot? I remember friends of mine used to sing that song to me to goof on me. Do you wear your jock a lot? Yes, I wear my jock a lot. And Susie Cream Cheese. I mean, to actually say that they're in the same league as the Mama and the Papas, bullshit.
Right.
Complete bullshit. So, in terms of rock and roll and all that, I mean, that's a big complicated thing. Any kid who grew up in the 50s listening to American Bandstand, because I remember when people were not allowed at their homes to listen to American Bandstand. I had a babysitter in Bronxville, New York, who was banned from listening to American Bandstand. So she used to come to my house when she babysat me and turn on American Bandstand. And I used to creep out the door because I was around 6 or 7 years old because I wanted to hear it too. I wanted to hear Elvis Presley and all that. So, I think that, it's interesting to hear that they're now being valorized as the greatest rock groups in the 60s. Well, I have to, differ from that because, R&B was really strong. What rock was doing in the 60s was synthesizing forms. When you see the British invasion coming over, what are they doing? They're basically synthesizing R&B and blues, to some extent country, less so country. But they're basically taking all the records that are coming over in the 50s to Liverpool and other places that they listened to avidly. They covered those songs and then came back to the United States and reshaped and played our own music, except they synthesized it. So I don't know. It's interesting, and I know people who were into artsy rock and roll.
Yeah.
I mean, I was asked to join a band in 1965. And I didn't because I snootily put up my nose and said, oh, no, I'm going to sing Renaissance music. Now, obviously, in retrospect, I probably should have, because I loved rock and roll. I probably should have jumped right enthusiastically into it and done it because rock and roll is so much fun. But, it's sort of interesting to see. And then the influence of jazz on the Velvet Underground, that I think is quite interesting because, yes, there was this synthesis of rock and roll and jazz. And what's interesting about the Velvet Underground is that they bring in avant-garde music too.
Yeah.
So that becomes an interesting mix. But the only reason we haven't pay attention to them is that they were associated with the factory of Warhol.
Right, yeah. And
who cares? I mean, Warhol was,
No, they had a lot of good promotion and the film makes good use of all the film Warhol made of them. I mean, one of the interesting things they do is Warhol, he basically shot, filmed each of the members like a full frontal, just like staring into the camera for minutes. And so they'll use that with them, with the same person, like talking about, what, doing like a narrative thing. So that's, and they do, Todd Haynes, he does some interesting stuff, like in terms of experimental. And of course, Lou Reed and Andy Warhol was very experimental in his use of film.
Yeah, I know, but see, you mentioned Jonas Mekas. I'm sure that we're
they interview him in it.
Yeah, if you have Gail on the phone, if Gail was here, she'd have a heart attack over Jonas.
Really?
Oh yeah, she hates Jonas Mekas, and Jonas Mekas.
Oh right, because he's involved with film anthology.
Well, he's the guy who set up the anthology, and Mekas was. Now I saw Mekas's films. The first time I ever saw Mekas's films, I was high on THC. So I must admit that watching Mekas's films, because Mekas had a great influence on filmmaking that some people deny, because all the sort of avant-garde experimental films of the 40s and 50s and 60s, Mekas was very much involved with. But Warhol. Warhol's films were bullshit. I mean, really, like some of those films, the Chelsea Girls and all the films he made were, everybody would rush to see them. Let's see what Warhol was doing. And it's sort of like going to see the Creme Master, who I hate, Barney. And later in the show tonight, we're going to talk about arts, because we're going to have an artist from Oakland joining us, John Sheridan, who's been an activist in KPFA for many years. But I don't know. It's a mixed bag. I mean, I'll go see it. So I certainly would,
yes.
But I'll certainly would be not closed-minded. But I have to say,
Sure.
like, once I hear Warhol mention the factory, I think of all the assholes over at Max's Kansas City, and it's just like,
Actually, one of the interesting things in is the women are very critical of how they felt. Like, they felt like just basically they were there as pretty faces.
Well, yeah. Look, the girls I know who went to, there was a girl, a young woman who was one of my, lusted after females in high school, who later became the one of the co-directors of Fame, the movie Fame. Oh. But she would go there. Oh, Jim, you have to. She wanted to take me. She actually took me, because I was still under 18, over to Max's Kansas City. I didn't have fake ID like the rest of them. They let me in there, and it was sort of like, this is 1966 going into Max's, and the other thing about it is that the art scene in New York. See, there's another aspect of this that doesn't necessarily come into play in a movie like this. Maybe the art scene in New York and Lower Manhattan. Like that's when that's when the whole beings and performance art was starting. That's when you had all sorts of experimental theater in Lower Manhattan, Cafe Wa, over there in the church in the East Village. You had Judson's. There's all these famous, like that's when all these different playwrights were in full gear. And so there's a whole bunch of experimentation in art. Remember, this is when Soho was an illegal place to live, and half the spaces down in Soho were empty. So who filled it up? I had friends of mine in high school whose mothers and fathers were living in illegal lofts, and that was, because they couldn't afford to live in the West Village. Imagine, you had to move from the West Village to Soho. So they got these 3,000 to 4,000 square foot lofts for like $300, $400, $500. Well, maybe back in the 60s, that was a lot of money, but still you could, with two people working, you could do it. And so there was a vast experimental art scene flourishing in the area, not necessarily where these guys were, which is the Lower East Side, because there was that going on down there. Remember, Ginsburg had a rent controlled apartment over there. The East Village was the East Village. It was still Ukrainian. Kenny would remember it, and so would Mike. I'm sure Dennis does. It was a mixed ethnic, racial neighborhood with public housing on the East River, and then all these Ukrainians and Bohemian types living between 14th Street and Canal Street. And then you had Soho. But that was a lively, artistic community with a lot of experimentation. So what the Velvet Underground is really part of is that whole ferment.
Yeah,
that's going on. That's of evolution from the beat culture, and remember all the major artists like Jackson Pollock and all these abstract artists. They had studios in the Village. They had studios on 14th Street. I once entered a space on 14th Street that had originally been a studio for Jackson Pollock. So there's all this stuff going on. So, but I have to say that, like, for them to get, to be recognized as the most influential rock and roll group of the 60s, I don't buy that.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Jim.
Well,
I'm
Mike
sure if any of them are alive, I'm going to send them a note. Jim doesn't think too much of you.
well,
That's fine. But there was a theater in the West Village. What's the name of it? Skipped my mind. I was on the stage there with some performers.
really.
It was the theater, the downtown theater in the village.
Ken,
That's
there were
Mike. Okay, Mike.
hundreds of
Hold
theaters
on,
in the
Mike.
West.
I gotta. Go ahead, Mike.
I was just correcting you. There were. You have to be a little more specific to say. Talking about there was a theater in the West Village is like talking about the Jewish guy in Las Vegas. It's
Not a movie theater. Not a movie theater.
I know, a regular theater. There were dozens of them all over the place in every nook and cranny. I mean, there were, as far as major theaters, no, there weren't, if any. There were very few of them.
I think it was called the East Village.
Well, that's in the East Village.
All right.
Anyway, there were a lot of theaters, and we have to remember that the whole real estate situation was different. I mean, you could not only live cheaply, but you can get a performance space for little to no money. You could have, basically, theaters would pop up. I mean, one of the first plays I did in Manhattan, and this was in the late 70s, early 80s or whatever. It wasn't even in the 60s. We were doing it in the basement of I don't even know what it was. We were just in a basement there. There were pipes all over the place. We had to act around the pipes, things. But people would go. People would go to see it. The one thing I want to say, but that's theater. Film was doing the same thing. A lot of reason for experimental film back then was money. People wanted to make a film, and you didn't have money. It wound up being experimental. But as crazy as some of these things might have been, because I mean, you can't compare them to the working class films that started in the 50s in Britain, or the New Wave, which is a form of New Wave, or the New Wave in France, or the neo-realism of Italy. I mean, those were much more constructed, even though they were experimental. They were much more well-constructed, more carefully thought-out films. And then, of course, you have people like Robert Wise and people who were doing films like Odds Against Tomorrow, in which they were doing experimentation with camera work and things like that, even in more mainstream films. But the experimental films, as somebody once told me, because I was once complaining about one experimental film that I was watching, which was about nothing. Like, what was that film, Empire State Building, where they just filmed the Empire State Building for 24 hours, and you'd see lights going on and off, and people would be sitting there saying, yeah, but I could do that on my own without having to sit in the theater. But as somebody once told me a long time ago, the reason it's called experimental is because they're experimenting. Some experiments work and some don't. So those that seemed to work kind of took off or developed a new kind of style. And those that didn't fell by the wayside or became, jokes either at the time or years later, or just running gags. We also have to remember that in the theater, people like Brecht and Kurt Weill, there was experimentation going on in the theater for the past 100 years. It just made its way into film when, after the studio system basically ended. When I say the studio system, I mean the MGM, the old Hollywood studio mogul system. When the antitrust stuff came in, and they couldn't own the theaters anymore, and that whole thing broke down in the 50s, yeah, then you had room. You had room because audiences were looking for something new. They were also sometimes the post-war generation, the World War II generation was looking for something more realistic. The children of the World War II generation were looking for something unusual, and when the counterculture movement in the 60s came out, yeah, people started saying they were experimenting. And you got to look at it this way: if people are going to experiment with drugs, they might as well experiment with film and theater also. Anyway, that's my opinion. Oh, one other thing. Have you noticed that there wasn't that much experimentation on television after live? You did during the live TV days in the 50s. But once something becomes corporatized, experimentation pretty much ends.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Well, let's follow up on that. I'm not sure about when you think about experimentation on TV, it would immediately come up with Ernie Kovacs and Bob and Ray on the radio, on the radio and on discs, and comics and stuff like that. And May I See Your Passport, Firesign Theater. I think that was like in the 60s and the 70s. So there was experimentation. And I'm kind of like with Jim in terms of the music, although there is some atonal music. Most of it's pretty bad. There's an opera called there's an opera that's really bad about it's about a boy who gets seduced by a man on a frigate in British Army. But there's a composer that everybody loves named Carl Orff. He wrote Carmina Burana, which you hear in most action movies. Dum 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 dum. Very good music. But he wrote an opera called Antigone, and he was noted for his oddball atonal stuff, where his instructions is like open up the piano and hit the keys with a hammer, throw things over, screech, take a cat and choke it till it's nearly dead. Do whatever he can to make different sounds. And then there's Glass too. I forget the guy's name. The guy who's famous for
Philip Glass.
Yeah, all the atonal music and so forth. And sometimes I think it's very effective, especially this one piece he wrote, Antigone, because the sounds correlated with what the story was. Oedipus takes out his eyes. Okay, so you can have like an atonal screech or something blowing up. You can have something sound-wise that's not melodic. But normally speaking, I've discussed, like in my youth, that certain forms of art could be associated with certain drugs. You get certain kind of music and art with marijuana, different kind with uppers or heroin or cocaine. It's characteristic. It's different. So like the Rolling Stones, the Rolling Stones were a certain kind of drug. The Beatles were like LSD and pot. And, this other guy's like heroin. Oh, there was the famous guy who is it? The guy, Teenage Angst, famous. His wife killed him. Because I lose all the names. He's great. Teenage. He's blonde. He's a famous guitarist. He died young. Supposedly he died from an overdose, but they say his wife killed him. Come on, Jim. Who am I thinking?
Cobain, you're talking
That's
about.
it.
At the Chelsea Hotel.
That's right. Kurt
Cobain. Yeah.
Kurt Cobain, right?
Nirvana.
There you go. Yeah, that's kind of like a heroin
That's
music.
later, though. That's later.
I know, but it's like a heroin music.
That's early
It's
90s.
you bang on a guitar and throw something at the people, and then you had these raves, and my son had gone to some. They throw people in the audience, or they have a mash.
Right.
They call it a mash. They kind of they don't have an adequate amount of challenge in life, so they go to a concert and start fake beating each other up.
It's like a scrum, yeah.
Yeah, it's a scrum. It's that kind of stuff. It's kind of like a beer thing. I used to say that with drinking too much beer. So
one thing about the Village that was different,
and
New York that was different from other parts of the country, was after World War II we had the highest concentration of movie theaters playing foreign films. In the Village itself, there were probably in 1970 at least 10 movie theaters. I'm talking about from 14th Street to Canal Street that played avant-garde, experimental foreign films in general. Right. Almost 10 movie theaters, right? And so that's where these guys are living. And then, like Michael's talking about theater, well, it's like off Broadway, off Broadway is centered in part in that part of Manhattan. And so these guys are in a very eclectic, creative environment. But, Dennis, you want to comment on what we're talking about? Let me shut my mouth here.
Gotta unmute Dennis.
Hey, mute. Hey, mute. There we go, Dennis. Come on, Dennis, unmute. Unmute Dennis. There we go. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yep.
I gotcha.
Yeah, okay. So what Jim's saying is correct. That's all. I mean, everything was happening in those days. It was, well, my situation was that I went to graduate school at NYU in the early 60s. By 1967, I was in Philadelphia. And so in other words, I saw the Philadelphia scene in the late 60s and early 70s. New York to me. Oh, by the way, I used to go. Malachi McCourt had a bar.
Oh, right.
I used to go to that bar.
Huh.
I found it it was the first singles bar that I knew about, and I brought a lot of people there.
Where was the bar, Dennis? On 72nd Street?
It was on 3rd Avenue between 63rd and 64th Street. And I don't know. I mean, it wasn't a dump, but it wasn't elegant either. And a lot of people were there, especially if you go on Friday night and Saturday, it was crowded. And he must have made it. I mean, I don't know what his connection was to the money people who backed the bar, but they made a lot of money on the weekends anyway. I know that. New York was great in the 50s and 60s, and I think what you're talking about sort of eclipses my time in the city, basically. Because when I was in Philadelphia, there's a lot of Philadelphia wasn't bad at all. I used to think Philadelphia was a hick town compared to New York, but it's not true. It was really very I don't know. It was in certain ways it was very progressive, and they had a big jazz scene there. I got connected to the jazz musicians, and these are people that used to go back and forth between New York and Philadelphia. They were from Philly, and they used to come back. And I was more into, even though I knew about rock and roll, I was really more into jazz. And people like Miles and what's his name, Coltrane. There were two of them. And Dizzy Gillespie, and there were a couple of pianists, Oscar Peterson and Ahmad Jamal. I really loved them, and I had more of a thing for the jazz, and I also liked the folk music, which started out in the early '60s on television. But I liked. Well, I like Baez, Joe Baez. I really liked, and Judy Collins,
Dylan,
and I don't know. I had a mixed reaction to Dylan.
Wow! Wow!
I mean, I liked his songs, but I don't think I liked him very much.
Well.
Okay.
You like Mick Jagger? I mean, it's the song.
No,
That's what matters.
I hated Mick.
Really?
No, the people that I liked were the Beatles after a while, but that started with the Sgt. Pepper's album.
Molly Hearts. Yeah.
Before that, I just saw them as, I don't know,
pop music, right?
Whatever, they were like teeny pop.
Yeah.
That's it.
Hold my hand, hold my hand.
Well,
you know,
Teeny boppers, right? But
Right.
when they started with the
they dropped some
Sergeant
acid and they came back.
Peppers,
Right.
they start. You talk about innovation. That
yeah, absolutely.
they were really big innovators.
Right.
Oh yeah,
Yep.
no.
Sergeant
Oh,
Pepper.
it's the first. It's the first concept album,
Yeah.
Sergeant Pepper.
Right.
That's right. There was another. Let me interrupt a second. There's another experimental film that is very moderate and is probably the most popular, the most well known. It's called Breathless. It's from 1960.
All right.
Oh,
Yeah.
Godard.
Experimental. John Paul Belmondo.
Godard.
Godard.
It's a Godard film.
No, yeah, that was the new wave. That's what the new wave we were talking about. The French new wave.
But see, what's different in France is that they have.
We lost you, Jim.
What's different in France is that they have a unique. All right. Basically, in France, what is influential with Godard and other French filmmakers in the New Wave is that they have an institution that they form after the war called the Cinémathèque. And what that is basically these guys are seeing everything. They're seeing every kind of form of American film. They're seeing every kind of form of film, frankly, from all over the world at the time. And I remember I went to the Cinémathèque once in Paris, which it was actually, they were having events in honor of the formation of the Cinémathèque. This back in 2007. And, that's something that is different. In New York, the Cinémathèque was everywhere. It wasn't like one place where one could go see and talk about cinema in that same fashion. And so that's in a way where you see like the new wave directors in France come out of that. Certainly like Godard, they all credit the Cinémathèque for what they were doing in terms of their artistry. Now, with someone like the Velvet Underground, in terms of their music, obviously they're in this incredible place which people are doing all these amazing experimental things. And that was what the art scene was in New York in the early 60s. And I don't think you can underestimate the power of that.
There's another one. Mike, I got to cut you off because I'll come to you in a second, but you got the feedback there. So there's another one interesting that came out, and I'm just thinking about it. It's a little bit geeky, but it's called Mondo Cane. And it was, big on the fringe market because they were showing oddball things.
Yeah, but they were showing basically people getting killed in Africa. I mean, it's sort of a Mondo Cane. I would not put as an experimental film. It was a sensation. It was sort of an early kind of slasher film, except
exploitation.
For real.
Okay, for real.
Because Mondo Cane was showing, violence porn.
Right.
Because they were showing people getting shot. They actually were showing, remember, they were showing people getting killed for real in Africa. And then Mondo Cane became sort of a film that was attacked by many because of the nature of what they were showing. It was sort of being sensationalistic in terms of showing violence. Now, of course, the 60s were filled with violence. You can't, obviously the sound system means only one of us can really talk at a time here.
Yeah, go ahead. Mike,
as
soon as I'll go to you as soon as Jim's done. Go ahead, Jim.
People were watching war on television every night. And sometimes it would be, they'd be watching corpses getting, guys getting killed in Vietnam, being dragged in firefights. So, there's that kind of reaction culturally in the psyche that sort of is there. And someone like the Velvet Underground, they were sort of part of the sort of art scene of the 50s and 60s that then began to look at music as an art form, particularly popular music, particularly rock and roll. So the Beatles, for example, began to be looked on differently, particularly after Sgt. Pepper. Although I started looking on the Beatles differently after I saw A Hard Day's Night. Uh-huh. And I remember I was actually suspended in high school with 4 other guys for disrupting a study hall because we were singing at Music and Art High School. We were coming down the rear stairs at Music and Art High School and doing a cappella singing out loud. We were developing our a cappella skills, singing rock and roll songs, and we were singing I Want to Hold Your Hand. So this asshole teacher comes running at us and says, "You can't do this. You can't disrupt the study hall." And she suspends us for a week. And then what further was ridiculous about it is that I was the only white kid among the other 4 guys, right? So the guidance counselor says, "Why are you hanging out with those guys?" Right?
Oh, my.
And the next day, my mother storms into the High School of Music and Art and raises holy hell because I'd been lectured like that. But, remember, that was part of it, too. That people were thinking if you were interested in rock and roll, or if you were interested in R&B and blues and jazz, many people looked at you awkwardly. They thought, I had people actually come up to me and say, "Well, why do you like the Temptations? Don't you realize that it's nigger music?" And I used to say to them, "What the fuck are you telling me shit like that for?" The same thing happened with jazz. And jazz, of course, is one of the great American art forms of the 20th century. It's one of the great genuine American art forms, like a Broadway musical, like R&B, etc. It's a great American art form from all sorts of different strands, but of course, based in African American music and sensibility. So anyway, that's the milieu that the Velvet Underground is operating in. So as far as I'm concerned, they are a footnote to what was going on. It may be interesting now for them to be valorized, but at that time, they were a footnote, and particularly since they were associated with a factory, which not everybody thought was the coolest thing since sliced bread.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So,
Ken, I can't hear you. So
that's right.
I guess
That's right. Everybody else turns their mic off when you talk.
A couple of things. I think that Mike, it's Mike. But anyway, the thing is, yeah, I was lucky enough to be in a less racist environment or something, but racism also played a large part of it. By the way, the only thing long lasting that came from the movie Mondo Cane was the song "More." Nobody I knew saw the movie, but they all knew the song. But I think also when we're talking about the new wave experimental film in the United States, we have to also include Cassavetes. John Cassavetes, who started doing experimental film in the late 50s. He would take the money he made from these, whatever later on biker films or supporting roles he had in films and whatever he did on television, if he did an Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And he'd take that money and he put them into these extraordinarily low budget films, and he was experimenting. And that was around the same time as the New Wave. And of course, the New Wave in not only in France, but in Britain and all over the world. So there was stuff going on in the United States. Now, Cassavetes' films didn't take off. None of them got anywhere until the late 60s, I believe. And I think it was with the film Husbands that really started making any money outside of a very niche audience. But there were several other people who were making these very low budget, very experimental films. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. That was happening starting in the late 50s. It only became more accepted. Audiences, it only got a larger audience around the late 60s when the whole counterculture movement came in. So we have to remember these people who were trying to do something in film and who actually had some training, either as actors or filmmakers or something, who very much knew what they were doing. They weren't just picking up a camera and saying, "What can I do with this?" Not that there's anything wrong with that to a degree, but these were people who knew what they were doing. They knew what the traditional way of doing things were. They were trained in it, and they decided to break away from that. Now, granted, a lot of people thought Cassavetes was nuts, he had this triumvirate of him and Peter Falk and Ben Gazzara, which is um, and they were this very New York group. Of course, Falk was Jewish and Gazzara was Italian, which is again interchangeable. And Cassavetes was a Greek Jew, and they had this whole New York ethnicity tied into it, including also with the actors, the acting troupe that they work with. A lot of times, experimental filmmakers would work with the same actors, the same group of actors, which very often came from avant-garde theater or even mainstream theater, but people who were looking for something a little different. So that movement was going on again earlier than most people think it was.
Okay, good enough. All right, I want to throw in a movie that's very contemporary that I was really really impressed with. It's called Tangerine, and what was notable about it was all shot on iPhones in neighborhoods that we could recognize down here, neighborhoods where you probably didn't have to pay a permit to shoot, like donut shops in South Central and stuff, and it was all about. All of the characters were African American transgendered prostitutes, and it was an incredible movie, and it's just remarkable because the guy could take whoever ran it. The guy, he used an iPhone. He used people that nobody wanted to get near, and just degenerate, terrible sets and locations, and made an incredibly funny and moving movie. A real piece of art. And so, there's a lot to be said for that. Like, if you people have made experimental movies that are not, shocking, like they come out with one or two every year, like they'll film the whole thing. The guy's buried in a coffin somewhere and they'll film the whole thing like that, or stuck in an elevator. Or they just had one called Guilty. It's one guy on the phone, Jake Gyllenhaal, something like that. He's on the phone doing a 9/11 call. There's some other people walking around, but he's the only speaking actor who's present. And I haven't seen it, and I'm not caring to. So people will do experimentations like that. Or, you could say Gravity was an experimental film. It was all shot up and, as if they're in space. So there was no throwbacks. Usually in sci-fi like that, they'll throw back. You talk to your daughter over the phone and they'll get shot in Iowa or something. But that was all in space, floating around. So experimental films happen. And there's other things with stop motion and so forth. But in terms of these avant-garde movements, it's really along the lines of Andy Warhol. And yeah, I would expect 90% of them are like ridiculous or pointless. We go to the galleries around here. I love it. I go for the, well, this is before the pandemic. But they're starting to open up again. You got wine, you got hors d'oeuvres or cheese, wine and cheese and crackers, and some good-looking women. And you go there. There's no art. There people hang their sneakers on the wall and call it art, or they throw a bucket of paint on something. There's very little art, but 5% of the art is really good. And some galleries carry real art, but the majority of the galleries, don't insult them. Don't make any bad comments. It's art. You don't understand it. It's all that crap, all that bullshit. Either you like it or you don't. So with the experimental film, it can be pique your curiosity, but on the other hand, they could go like, okay, well, they're just doing things to be obtuse and reverse. They're doing everything backwards, like they're going. Oh, there was two other films. This one became very popular. They shot a whole movie from. This was done in the 40s too. One movie, a point of view movie from one character that you never see. It never even looks in a mirror. And then, this was an action movie. I think it was called Henry or something.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Right. And it'll just go zoom, 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 zoom through everything. And, okay. So it's like, if you want to put on a type, it's sort of, that's what it reminds me. It's like an art movie is like when you put on a pair of pants that are too tight. It's like, oh, geez, I'm going to have to pay attention to this. It's annoying. that I can't figure out who's who and or what's what. But let's see if there's any benefit to it. It's like a pair of tight pants. So let's see. I had a list of other experimental movies, but I would much rather if somebody came up with it.
Yeah, Kenny.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, let me comment about Tangerine, which I also saw, which is absolutely hilarious.
Right.
One of the things that is interesting about Tangerine, and I think back on a film festival that when I was living with Drake Stutzman, we went to Nairobi to a African film festival, and they had people there. This is back in 2009. There were people shooting on their cell phones.
Right.
And some guy made a film that was at the Cannes Film Festival. It was shot on basically on Androids. Now, what's interesting about the movie Tangerine is it's shot on a couple of iPhones, and they edited it in Final Cut Pro. And what's sort of the relationship to, let's say, the Velvet Underground milieu is that at that point in time, there was a revolution going on in terms of 8mm Super 8 cameras. People could go and buy a cheap camera and then shoot a movie, edit it, and then transfer it to 16mm. And that was going on throughout the 60s. And that was a big revolution technologically for underground film, because it wasn't that expensive to buy a Super 8. And if you edited it and you actually could sell it to somebody, they could transfer it and blow it up into 16mm, which was the standard at that point for when you were shipping out films around the United States or around the world in terms of being broadcast. I mean, that was the standard that was actually created before World War I, when the whole 16mm, the whole idea of having a 16mm frame on film was actually introduced. So technologically, what's interesting about these films you talk about, and particularly with Tangerine, which is basically about transgender drag queens fighting it out, it's sort of hilarious. These kind of films became cheaper and easier to make and less difficult to finance. And of course, to me, the most weirdest underground film ever done was Night of the Living Dead, because that movie was done on a budget, I think, of about $100,000 or $50,000, and then it became this. And then one had to look and see. Okay,
Jim, it became a genre.
Well,
a genre.
It already was. It already
5 TV programs all at once.
Right. The zombie film genre had already, the zombie movie genre was an aftermath of our occupation of Haiti, starting from 1915 on. And so all the early there was a silent movies done and early talkies done. I think Bela Lugosi is in one of the movies on zombies, but they all were based on the white female being abducted and then turned into a zombie.
Right. It's a different story than bodies coming out of the grave.
Right. But then the question became, why the hell does a weird ass movie like Night of the Living Dead, which, as you recall, the black hero was killed.
Right, black hero, very unusual.
He's killed at the end by the white vigilantes. They blow him away because they think he's a zombie or whatever. Why does a movie like that have resonance? Because I would go into the Waverly Theater in Lower Manhattan, and the theater would be packed to the gills with people coming in to watch other human beings getting eaten up by other people.
Right.
And that was, I would say, a successful zombie genre film. And then, of course, later on, when he gets money, Romero does a movie where the only place that zombies can come back to is a place that's deep in their id that they can remember, a shopping center. So they have this scene where all the zombies are coming back to a shopping center and defending the shopping center from being overwhelmed by zombies. It sort of made me laugh watching that. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that in. But yes, Tangerine was hilarious.
Yeah, it was, but I really appreciated the guy who created it. The skill, and then he and his positioning of there was another thing in it about Armenians, which we have a lot of Armenians in LA and Glendale and stuff. But it was just, it was a low life. It's all about low life, but it had no violence, no car chases, just, dialogue and situations. much, much better than Downton Abbey or anything like that. $1 billion projects. This thing had gravitas. Tangerine. If you can get it, you got to watch it. It's a real kicker. Anybody else come up with? Well, Alex, besides this love affair with the Velvet Underground, what oddball movies have you appreciated? Come on, Alex.
Well, I'll just mention kind of foreign film that Gail and I just saw that she really actually that we both really love, which is we went to see Francesco Rossi's Illustrious Corpses, which is playing at the Film Forum also, and it's got this completely out there. I had no idea that the out there plot of it's actually like the government is plotting against the communists. It's set in Italy. There's all this intrigue. These judges are getting killed, but to spoil it for everybody, in the end, there's like essentially a plot from kind of within the government against the Italian Communist Party to kind of like it's based on some actual things about the so-called strategy of tension in the 70s and 80s in Italy, where fascist elements were actually conducting bombing attacks in order to keep any kind of leftist government from coming into power. But it's Lino Ventura is the main character, who's even though he mostly plays in French films, but here he's a French Italian, so here he's speaking Italian all the way through, playing the detective essentially, and who's trying to ferret out what's the real plot. And they have some great Italian actors that Gail remembered, but also Max von Sydow is this great judge who's kind of at the center of the plot essentially. But it's also about it's incredibly the locations this guy was able to find. Rossi, he's got these great interiors. He's also a lot of darkness in it. Like it opens essentially in this actual catacombs with these decaying mummies, where the first judge that gets killed goes to visit. Then he comes out into the light and gets shot by the killer, who's at who you never. That's the other thing, you never see the killer in it. So he's shooting people with from a distance with a silenced rifle, and so it's also very atmospheric. And I would think of it as kind of out there for the period. Even of course we know Italian film Fellini is a lot of innovation and a lot of experimentation through the 60s and 70s. I mean, something like La Dolce Vita, and again, 8.5. But even I've never seen it, and I don't really want to see it. Of course, there's that famous film about that crazy fascist republic in northern Italy at the end of the war. What's it called? The
Sasso Republic.
Right. Sodom. Who I forget that's supposed to be just almost unwatchable. Kind of like that you were talking about the film where they show people getting killed. Again, I think that was part of the intent, like to show the kind of depravity of humanity, and to really almost get the viewer to kind of like want to throw up and watching the film. So to kind of from the filmmaker to provoke the viewer with like an incredibly negative reaction to the film, to kind of like steep yourself in like the depravity, the filth, essentially.
Well, let me interrupt a second. I guess this is all pre-Trump, where you had to make an effort to do something that's inane and scary and everything. Now you got Trump, and there's less of a market for it now, because you can get it any day.
See, Francisco Rossi, as a director, he is his first great films were on the mafia, back in the late 50s. That's all this guy did. He just explored in all his works. I wouldn't say all of them, but the most significant ones were basically films about the corruption of government and its involvement with organized crime. And he started there and didn't leave that theme. He did a movie about Lucky Luciano that had Rod Steiger in it. He used to work with Rod Steiger a lot.
Okay.
Because people forget that Steiger was one of the great, I think, post-war American actors.
Right.
And Steiger, at that time, was working with foreign actors in Europe.
Okay, so that it makes sense that you use Max von Sydow, another foreign.
Oh yeah, Max.
Although basically I got the set. I'm pretty sure that his dialogue was completely dubbed because I don't think his Italian is good as.
With someone like him, with someone like Rossi, you got to put him in the same kind of field as directors like Pontecorvo, who does Battle of Algiers, or Pasolini, who was a great director, did a fantastic movie about Christ and other films, and Ettore Scola and Valerio Zorlini. These are all guys that are the sort of lefty reactions to neorealism, and of course, Fellini is working as an assistant director to Rossellini on Open City. That whole series of movies, Open City, Paisan, and Year Zero, Fellini's involved with. But I just want to throw in the mix another underground, just to sort of throw it into left field here. I love John Waters. I love Hairspray.
Oh, he's interviewed in the Velvet Underground documentary too.
Well, he's like, and they used to have them as midnight films in the Village.
Right.
Polyester and Hairspray and Pink Flamingos were sort of, and what's that crazy film, the Rocky Horror Show?
Rocky Horror Picture Show, yeah.
Rocky Horror Picture Show. People, that was so nuts that people go in and sit there and imitate the songs as they'd be singing along with Mitch, so to speak, in the Rocky Horror Show.
Well, yeah. Then you get into like cult films, like that other crazy film, The Room, that people go to see because it's so bad it's good, essentially.
Well, yeah, but that's a whole different thing. But yes, underground, and then I would also say experimental film in general influenced advertising, influenced mainstream. Look at the way you have rapid cuts made in TV and cinema. The use of handheld cameras, that sort of spills over from experimental film. And then look at how people by the late, like someone like Warhol. I mean, people forget the term hippie capitalism. Or like it shows you how resilient capitalism is a system to absorb critics. So by the late 60s and early 70s, you're selling mass market records where you're playing, the Rolling Stones are playing Sympathy for the Devil, or other songs. The Beatles do their Attack on the 60s in the White Album. But you're having all these songs working, like the Stones, of course, were sort of epitomized as sort of quote being the rebellious spirit of the 60s, except they're making Laughing to the Bank. So the whole idea of the rebellious nature of the cultural trends, which were indeed rebellious, no doubt about it, but boy, did they get commodified so rapidly that by the early 70s they're just part of commodity culture like everything else.
Well, yeah, Jim, I think the most obvious thing we see every day about that is the hairdos. The kind of haircuts people are getting.
Oh yeah.
Like it's somebody shaved all his hair and put Brussels sprouts or something on broccoli on his head. You get these crazy haircuts, and they're all over the place.
Right.
And they're on the media too, and everybody's got the Nazi haircut and the mohawk, or just a new invention, or they scrape some name in the back. It's gone over the top. So no matter how ridiculous your point is well made, no matter how ridiculous or contrary somebody does in terms of fashion or art, it can turn into the mainstream. It can become popularized.
Well, people look. Richard Nixon got reelected in 1972.
Yeah.
Before the election, I drove across the country with a bunch of friends. And I learned pretty quickly that you couldn't trust anybody who was wearing long hair politically. The only thing you had to do was shift the discussion to drugs. And then that way you'd get around the problem of arguing about Richard Nixon. But, it became a situation where, you know, the counterculture had spread and morphed into this popular phenomena that, you know, like, oh, I don't want to talk about politics, man. You got some good marijuana? And that would be the way to avoid any bullshit arguments with people as you went into situations where you'd see some guy who looked like he stepped out of Haight Ashbury, and then he loves Spiro Agnew. And you sort of said, okay, you know, fuck it, man. Let's roll the joint and just shut up about this stuff. But
Now,
you know, that's unfortunately the quote, the aspect of art popularizing itself and morphing and absorbing itself into the mainstream culture of this society, which, you know, and then you'd have these ridiculous arguments with people who are doing revolutionary art. Well, I'm doing my revolutionary art, and, you know, that will change consciousness. I said, fuck that bullshit. You know, mass struggle changes consciousness, not goddamn revolutionary art. And you have these stupid arguments with people in New York about that, which were just fucking stupid. They'd be sitting in some bar, and it reminded you of Amiri Baraka, or when he was Leroy Jones. He wrote a poem about Max's Kansas City. And the poem was on the politics of artists, and it was a very satirical poem, because, you know, when Leroy Jones was married and before he, you know, became an outright nationalist, you know, he lived in the Village. Mm-hmm. So and when you're talking about it, it reminds me of how powerful that satire was about the politics of rich white artists and how much that didn't mean jack shit in the real world.
Okay, Jim. We're going to come to a close here. So I want to go to Michael. He's been awfully quiet, and then Dennis, and then I think we're going to wrap it up. And just one thing I wanted to say. Hold it. Don't. You can't talk until I turn off everybody else's mic. So it's going to go to you now.
Unmute, Mike.
Come on,
Then
Mike.
we go to Dennis.
Let's hear from you, Mike. Mike, are you there?
So can you hear me now? Okay, good.
I'm unmuted.
And I should just say that with, you know, a lot of the stuff we were talking about with that were experimental, such as George Romero, they were pretty much more cult films. We're forgetting about what, you know, in other words, an experimental film. It could be experimental as far as form, but also what was the filmmaker trying to do? If the filmmaker is just trying to become a filmmaker, or just trying to reach their audience or make money, yeah, they may be experimenting, but I wouldn't consider it part of a movement. It really, what the filmmaker is trying to do. For instance, if you look at Baraka was my professor, one of my professors in university at Stony Brook, and he was a great guy, great teacher, and a very, very high intellect, and a very strict teacher, as a matter of fact. But he knew exactly what he was saying and what he was trying to do. So if he wrote something that broke a form, or broke away with anything, in other words, changed the form, or seemed like it was less linear and hard to follow, he knew what he was doing and why he was doing it. And that's a difference that I think we need to explore. Also, the fact is that a lot of these things, these so-called avant-garde or experimental filmmakers, a lot of them have already been, like when we talked about music, it's already been corporatized. So it's already been shoved into the mainstream. That's why people are eating it up. The real breakthrough people are the people who started out, and most of them are not only not remembered, but weren't even recognized at the time. But they were the ones making the real breakthroughs. I remember when I was studying with Stella Adler used to tell us as actors, they said, you have to know the form, know the right way to do things, and then if you're going to break that form, you do it as a choice. And so I think that the filmmakers that really should either did or should have had the most impact, such as Fellini, were people who knew what the actual previous form was, the previous style was, accepted style. And they said, I'm going to break it. I'm going to break it for a reason. And I am going to change things or look at things from a different way because I want to say something um, that way. And I want to try a new, maybe more subjective or more less structured way of doing things. But those people would also, there's a tendency now to say, well, let's use non-actors, or let's use, or they're not professional, they don't know anything about filmmaking, but I'll just say, well, I'll let it fly. Those aren't people who are, that's not worth nearly as much. The people who knew what they were doing and doing it for a reason. And we have to remember that when Fellini did L'Estrato, which was his first, shall we say, hit film, I mean, he had two major American movie stars in it, which was Anthony Quinn and Richard Basehart. And that helped get it to more international audiences, even though the dubbing on them wasn't too good. When they were dubbed into an Italian originally, and then when they dubbed them back into English, they didn't use Basehart or Quinn's voices. But things like that, there was again more structure, and the people making this had more respect for art, for even the previous forms of art. They had respect for artists and works of art that tried to do something, that tried to say something that were a little bit more profound.
We go to Dennis. Give us some parting words, Dennis. Words of wisdom.
One night I was at Malachi's bar on 3rd Avenue, and who did I see? With dark glasses on, sitting in the back, Montgomery Clift. And Montgomery Clift was just eyeing the scene. And I thought to myself, he must be high on heroin. That was Montgomery Clift. And I also saw Mondo Connie in New York. And that was an experience. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks. And so you've been listening to and watching Going Viral, the movie show. And we're going to go out now. But before we do, I'll say it was Ken Aaron here on the West Coast, Jim Dingman.
Oh, excuse me, Ken.
Yes,
I have to
go
say
ahead.
one more thing.
Go ahead,
In
Dennis.
1963, I went to Carnegie Hall, and there was a concert for Burt Parker had deceased earlier. I don't know when, but they honored him, and I must have seen every major jazz musician. I would say hip hop, not hip hop, but the bebop. All the bebop people were there that I could even think of. And, I mean, it was a real treat.
I talked to some of those guys, and they say, you know who else was there? Dennis Goldstein was there. There you go. Okay, so we're wrapping up now, and it's Ken Aaron on the West Coast, Dennis Goldstein, Alex Stavropoulos, Jim Dingman, and Michael Jankowitz on the East Coast, in or near New York City. So here we go, and here comes our outro in a second. And it's coming up right now. And it is the outro for this. Here we go. And